The Greek Septuagint was their main scripture. He says that he discussed 1st and 2nd century word usages dealing with divine corporeality. And for Origen, the ignorance is contributed to misunderstanding some of the biblical and some of the earlier texts. And he pointed out that nowhere in the Bible is God explicitly described as incorporeal. Now this is Origen, the early church father. He says, no, that's not in the Bible, but you're misunderstanding what the Bible meant, because with philosophical teachings, God is incorporeal. But that's not the apostolic doctrine. Origen is reading philosophy back onto the scriptures. And unfortunately, he's changing the doctrine of the kind of being that God really is. The Greek term for incorporeal, asomatos, does not appear in the Bible. That's not a biblical word, because that wasn't a biblical teaching. Even where the term does appear in early non-scriptural Christian writings, Origen claimed that it does not have the same meaning that the Greek and the Gentile philosophers assigned to it. What they assigned to the meaning of asomatos was incorporeality. But that's not what the biblical Greek word means. This is Origen saying this. Rather, he asserted Christian writers simply use the term to refer to a material body that is much finer and less palpable than those that can be perceived through the senses. Asomatos, translated in Greek philosophical terms as incorporeal, in the Christian Judaic terms meant a finer substance than the gross physical body. This is what Jesus meant when he told his apostles, "Handle me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see me have." No, it doesn't. It is a finer material substance. It's not the gross physical, it's a more subtle material. But it is not incorporeal, and spirit is not opposite of body. It's a very important teaching of Origen, as he is elaborating the early Christian interpretation so that he can change it to please the philosophers. For example, he explained in his treatise, The Doctrine of Peter, this is where the resurrected Jesus is quoted as saying to his disciples, "I am not an incorporeal demon." This statement must be understood to mean that he had not such a body as demons have, which is naturally fine and thin, as if formed of air, and for this reason is either considered or called by many incorporeal, but that he had a solid and palpable body. You notice the early Christians used the proper Greek word pneuma, which is from the root pneo, to mean wind, breath, air. They didn't think those were incorporeal. They knew those were matter. That is the basis of the Greek. And Origen says that. Now, according to human custom, everything which is not of that nature is called by the simple or the ignorant incorporeal. Wow, there's a switch. It's not the early Christians who believe in corporeality that are primitive, ignorant, and superstitious. It is those who think they are incorporeal that are simple and ignorant. As if one were to say that the air which we breathe was incorporeal. See, they knew it wasn't. Because it is not a body of such a nature that can be grasped and held or can offer resistance to pressure. That's a complete diametric opposite view of today's Christians. But it is the early Christian teaching. Among the early Christian writers who describe God as asomatos, Origen was the first, with the possible exception of Clement of Alexandria, to consistently use the term in its technical sense as a Platonist. In doing so, Origen followed the lead of the 2nd century non-Christian Middle Platonists such as Albinus. He followed the philosophers, not the scriptures. And that's where he got off track, because he valued the philosophy and not the scriptures, or the early Christian and Jewish understanding of those scriptures. that taught not only is body and material and corporeal, but so is spirit. And Origen offers us a most astonishing proof that the early Christians believed spirit was material. He says, I know in his attempt to explain the New Testament passage, God is a spirit. John 4:24. Now that's one translation. Technically, literally, the Greek is God is spirit, but the King James says God is a spirit. And there have been some evangelical Christian scholars who say God is only a spirit, but that is simply not what the Greek teaches. The Greek teaches God is spirit. So listen to how Origen explains this. He says, I know that some will attempt to say that even according to the declaration of our own scriptures, God is a body, because they find it said in the Gospel according to John that God is a spirit, and they who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Spirit, according to them, is to be regarded as nothing else than a body. This was the Christian teaching. Spirit is body, according to Origen. Now, this surprising statement is easily explained. Pneuma translated spirit literally means air or breath, implying that spirit is composed of a material substance, one of the four basic elements, and the Christians obviously knew that. You can get that from their writings. Furthermore, since Christian Stoics believed that existence was confined to material bodies, then God being spirit was the purest of all bodies. Notice this. Today's Christians say spirit is opposite of a body. But the early Christians taught that spirit is the most pure of all material bodies, being a more fine, subtle substance. Origen engaged in sustained polemics against those who affirmed God's human-like embodiment. So that when we read Origen's writings, we are not reading the early Christian beliefs. We are reading Origen's arguments against those beliefs. Origen taught God incorporeal. Spirit is incorporeal. It is immaterial. It is the opposite of body. That was not the belief of the Christians. He was arguing to convince them that this philosophical teaching is more correct than their own scriptures. So when we read the early church fathers, when someone quotes Origen to you saying, see, the early Christians believed God is incorporeal, that's not true at all. Not only does the Greek of the New Testament scriptures affirm that spirit is material and it is a body, but Origen is arguing against that doctrine. He is not representative of the early Christian beliefs. He is the representative of adapting the Greek Platonic metaphysical philosophy against God having a body. This is the beginning of the apostasy away from the true understanding of the nature of kind of God. This is fascinating. It's very important to keep that in mind. He says, well, he adapted the allegorical interpretation, is what Origen did. Wolfson admits that in the Scripture, now the scholar Wolfson, he admits that in the Scripture there is no indication that by spirit and soul were meant any such principles as form or immateriality. They were not about immateriality at all. They were about finer substance. Now, what makes all this so fascinating? Got to get these weeds out of my way. What makes this so fascinating is that Origen acknowledged that the Jews indeed, but also some of our own people, supposed that God should be understood as a man. That is, adorned with human members and human appearance. Because in many scriptural passages, God is described as speaking to men. But since, as Origen maintained, and this is quoting Origen, this is why Origen fought against the doctrine, is because the philosophers despised these stories as fabulous, and they formed in the likeness of poetic fictions.